Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We are back on the record.
Thank you, and we're ready to proceed with allegation number 3, which is appealed by Mr. Okay, roll call to reconvene.
Okay. Mr. Soretta?
Here, back.
Mr. Holt?
I'm sorry, what's the motion?
It's the motion to reconvene.
Yes.
That you're
Yes.
still in attendance. Ms. Gregory? Here. Mr. Grimes?
Yes, in here.
Mr. Meckel?
Yes.
Mr. Foltz?
Yes.
Mr. Fleckner?
Here.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Mr. Osborne.
Let me start with this. On November 26, 2012, the largest property tax abatement in the history of the city of North Canton, one that with appreciation of property values over 12 years could total in excess of $800,000 was approved. The tax exemption is claimed to be unknown to every single official at City Hall. This tax exemption was ostensibly unknown for nearly 3 years. So to speak to Mrs. Gregory's concern that you didn't appeal in a timely fashion, how would we? Mayor Hale claims he didn't even know anything about this. These are the circumstances under which Mr. Eric Bowles, the city's former Director of Permits and Development, gave his approval of a tax exemption for Northridge Place LLC. The circumstances surrounding this tax exemption would raise alarm bells with anyone upon hearing these facts, and should raise alarm bells with this housing council. Why wasn't this tax exemption reported and covered in the annual meeting of Housing Council? It was not reported in the Housing Council meetings on March 15th, 2013, 4 months after the exemption. Nor was it reported March 25th, 2014, 16 months after the exemption was given. Nor on March 13th, 2015, 28 months after the exemption was given. And you're saying we should have appealed within 30 days? I have to laugh, Mrs. Gregory. Why? Was there something to hide? The exemption was finally revealed at an annual meeting of the city's Housing Council held on March 30th, 2016. And I didn't get wind of it myself until Mr. Bowles revealed it in a council meeting sometime in April of last year, when we were starting that whole fiasco about the CRA. 30 months after the property tax exemption was given, Mr. Bowles revealed the exemption. Why? Was there something to hide here? Not a single city official knew about this? Mr. Bowles was operating on his own behind closed doors? I find it all very hard to believe. But here's what the Mayor Held had to say at a August 22nd, 2016 special council meeting. Mayor Held says, and I quote, "Why would anyone approve a tax abatement for an apartment complex? That tax abatement for the apartment complex is something personally I would never support. That he personally would never support the Northridge abatement, and that his hunch is that council members wouldn't be so excited about supporting something like that, because why would we give away tax money to bring in apartment complexes?" Mayor Hale goes on to say, people are upset because I'm upset. We have members of council who were upset, very upset. You remember that, Mr. Soretta? I hope you do, because this enrages me. We want to know why it didn't go before this council. We want to know why it didn't go before the school board. So it is very upsetting. Mayor Hale goes on. He finally concludes the abatement to Northridge was stupid. In the application, which is entitled Application for the Residential Community Reinvestment Area Program, signed by Eric Bowles, Mr. Bowles certifies the following. The above application meets the requirements for an exemption under Ohio Revised Code, Section 373567D1 or 373567D2. 373567D1 talks about cost of remodeling, not new construction. 373567D2 references Division F, which states, and I quote, "The owner of a dwelling constructed in a community reinvestment area may file an application for an exemption after the year the construction first became subject to taxation." Well, that clearly did not happen here. The certification by Mr. Bowles that one or both of the two statutes noted above were met is untrue. Further, the application for residential abatement, which Northridge was not, it's zoned commercial. And further, it was investment property. Mr. Lemon and Mr. Dehoff did not build this because they wanted a place to live and they needed a roof over their head. This is a group of investors in a commercial venture trying to make money. This was never going to be owner-occupied residential property, which is what the North Canton CRA program was all about. They wanted people to upgrade the older housing in the city. The application certified by Mr. Bowles was a complete fraud. Now, we've talked about our city ordinance, and I think it was kind of poorly written because much of that ordinance basically explains the entire CRA program. It explains what the state has made available to all communities, the umbrella on which we are allowed to operate. All CRA legislation beginning with Ordinance 2299 have limited the exemption of property taxes on residential property to remodeling only. Now, just like Mrs. Roll said earlier, this city and others have had several years to examine this and look for loopholes and try to explain and cover what Mr. Bowles did. I had asked you a year ago for Bricker and Eckler's report. Did they find what the city may or may not have done correctly? Mayor Hale promised he would provide that to show that the city did nothing wrong. He has not provided it. Section 5 of the ordinance is the nuts and bolts of what we're talking about here. Section 5 of Ordinance 2299 and all subsequent CRA ordinances say the same thing. They mention the following requirements to qualify for exemption of property taxes by stating the following periods of real property tax exemption shall apply to all residential property. A, 10 years for remodeling of dwellings containing not more than 2 units and upon which the cost of remodeling is at least $25,000 as described in ORC 3735.67D1. Or B, 12 years for remodeling of dwellings containing more than 2 units, and upon which the cost of remodeling is at least $50,000 as described in ORC 373567D2. Or C, 15 years for construction of dwellings described in ORC 373567D3. Well, as I just noted earlier, D1 only applies to remodeling. D2 only applies to remodeling. And D3 applies to historical or architectural significance certified historic structures. The statement of certification dated November 26, 2012, and signed by North Canton's housing officer, Mr. Eric Bowles, attests that the properties met the requirements set forth in those 2 state statutes. The tax exemption submitted by Mr. Bowles, North Canton's housing officer, and now no longer North Canton's housing officer, failed to comply with 373567 as well as North Canton CRA legislation. Mr. Bowles, at a minimum, erroneously certified the application for the residential CRA program, and at worst, fraudulently certified the application. In either instance, North Canton's housing officer exceeded his authority when he attested that the property complied with the state and local requirements for an exemption of property taxes. Now, if they had gone the commercial route, 3735-671A requires that the legislative authority and the owner of the property enter into a written agreement prior to the commencement of construction. There was and never have been such a written agreement. So whether you look at the commercial route that they could have taken or the residential route, it's screwed up no matter which way they go. ORC 3735-671A1 requires that the Board of Education approve of the written agreement between the legislative authority and the owner of the property prior to approval by the legislative authority. The Board of Education never received nor approved of a written agreement. The legislative authority, North Canton City Council, never approved a written agreement. 3735.671A2 states Board of Education approval of the written agreement is not required to receive a 50% tax reduction, but does require formal approval by the legislative authority, namely North Canton City Council. North Canton City Council has never seen nor approved of any tax reduction for North Ridge Place. There's a lot of development that has occurred up there in that area. No abatement was given to CVS, O'Reilly's, the insurance company around the corner. We act like Mr. Dehoff has done us a huge favor by cleaning up an area that had long passed its prime. There have been other murders in the city. Down here at 7th and Main, next to the hobby shop, Dick Fano's place. There was a double murder there. In the apartments back behind all that, there was a murder-suicide. Why was this kept secret? Typically, politicians love to trumpet, oh, look at the great things we're doing. And this was kept secret for almost 3 years? There was a reason. Mr. Bowles had no idea what he was doing. He exceeded his authority And we all know, if anybody ever knew Mr. Bowles, he was like a little mouse. He didn't do a thing unless somebody gave him their approval. For Mayor Held to tell me and publicly say he didn't know about this, I've got a city councilman who's told me he did, and he knew of it within a week. When this all came before city council, was there any outrage on council? Would we do this again? We see where it's gotten us. We're at war now with the North Canton City Schools. And Mr. Soretta, up until this moment, I was against their income tax, property tax levy. I am 100% for it now. Because this is what you have brought upon this city. And I hope it does pass. Now,
That's not an issue here tonight, sir. You got a minute to wrap up.
so this was illegal. It was kept secret. Our zoning code limited all that boilerplate language that was in Ordinance 2299 and repeated in other ordinances. Mr. Revolt knows the intent. Mr. Foltz knows the intent. You were there and voted for it. Were we going to issue a blank check for anybody to build investment property all over town and walk away with nearly millions of dollars? Mr. Dehoff, if you really cared about this community, you have already received almost $180,000. That pays for the property. You only paid $173,000 for it.
Please wrap it up.
It would be nice if you would just terminate it at this
Mr.
point.
Osborne, we're not dealing with personal vendettas.
There's no
Personal-
vendetta.
But you're attacking individuals that are not a part of this. That is not what we're discussing. So stick to the issue at hand. Your 15 minutes are up. Thank you.
They were up a long time ago when it comes to coming up here and talking, I'll tell you.
Mr. Fox, go
As
ahead.
I had with some others here, just to be clear, I certainly made note of the allegations. And they're similar to what we had before. And so, again, with Mr. Fryer, our current housing officer, are you aware of what Mr. Osborne has alleged? Is it included in any state statute or any North Canton ordinances that the mayor approve of a community reinvestment tax abatement?
No, it's not. In fact, the mayor is not part of the legislative body, so he wouldn't participate in approving of a commercial or industrial one, nor is he the housing, well, I guess the city could appoint the mayor as the housing officer, but in North Canton, he is not the housing officer, and therefore he has no authority to grant residential ones like the housing officer does.
And as we had discussed earlier, does the state statute provide that the appointed housing officer is the sole approving authority for a residential application for a CRA tax abatement?
That is correct.
Okay.
And in fact, they're actually not even given leeway. It says if it complies, then they shall forward on the application and approve that.
So if the application demonstrates that a parcel of land is located within a CRA area and the housing officer has determined that they've met their financial obligation according to the CRA, you're stating that there is no discretion, that the housing officer must approve it?
That's my understanding of the statute, state statute, correct.
Thank you. The issue about, again, it was raised that it's zoned commercial, and indeed it's a GBA. We had mentioned whether or not residential multifamily dwellings are permitted in the GBA zone district. Is that correct? It's a permitted use?
That is correct. Multifamily residential dwellings are permitted use in the GBA commercial zone. And as we have stated multiple times this evening, pursuant to the state statutes, it's based on the use and not so much the zoning classification, but the use within those zoning classifications.
Thank you. He also mentioned the purpose of our local ordinance is that these are for owner-occupied properties. In your research and preparing for this evening, did you see any indication whatsoever of a requirement of owner-occupied properties?
I have not. The only indication in Ordinance 2299 states that new construction doesn't qualify it any further than that.
Very good. And so in your review of the application from Northridge for new construction, as well as we have discussed a number of times this evening, how it's indicated on the certificate of occupancy, in your opinion, is there any indication whatsoever in the documents that we looked at this evening, in the testimony that we received this evening, that the intent for the Northridge tax abatement was for rehabilitation and not new construction?
All the documents that I have reviewed, from the certificates of occupancy, the application, the enabling statute, all point that this is new construction. And in looking at how the housing officer approved those, it's my belief that he understood that this was new construction and not rehabilitation.
One more question for you. If, say, the housing officer received an application for new construction, does he have the legal authority to make the determination that it's only for rehabilitation, or would his approval of that application deem it's for new construction?
Could you repeat that question?
Yes. If the housing officer received an application and that application stated that it was for new construction, would the housing officer, in approving the application, have any authority to approve it for anything other than new construction?
He shouldn't. Based on that application, he should approve or deny it based on how the application is submitted.
Thank you. Those are questions that I wanted answered myself, so if members of the board have additional questions.
Any additional?
We certainly, if you don't, then the appellee has the opportunity to respond.
Mr. Whitcart?
Thank you. Are there no other questions? Okay. Once again, I would like to make a motion that the council allow the testimony and the exhibits that have been given and will be admitted in the prior two appeals, both Mr. Revolt's appeal and Mrs. Roll's appeal, be included in the transcript as if they were also given in this specific appeal. Is that appropriate, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, let's do that. At this point, is there a motion?
Motion to include?
Any other discussion? Roll call, please.
Mr. Grimes.
Yes.
Mr. Holt.
Yes. Yes.
Mr. Gregory.
Yes.
I'm sorry,
All right,
Mr.
no worries.
Gregory. Thank you. Mr. Foltz.
Yes.
Mr. Meckel. Yes. Mr. Sorrell.
Yes.
Mr. Fleckner.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. So this board has already determined in a prior appeal that the project is deemed residential. The housing officer has very clear authority under the statute and under your ordinance to certify the exemption at issue. the ordinance and the statute clearly, specifically provide for an available exemption for residential new construction. I think that the council has heard appropriate and accurate testimony relative to the issues that were raised on appeal. I'll reserve my remaining 13 minutes or so for rebuttal, but I have nothing further. Thank you.
Thank you. Housing Council, what's your pleasure? Is there a motion? So that we can discuss.
I don't see anything new that was presented in this case that makes it any different from the other ones, based on the facts and the forms that were presented to us. That's part of my discussion. If anybody wants to come in on that.
I feel like any further discussion is redundant.
So with that, I move a motion to deny the appeal.
Is there a second?
Second.
Roll call. Any further discussion? Roll call, please.
Mr. Holt,
Yes.
Mr. Foltz,
Yes, do we have to state reasons again, or?
I recommend that you.
Well, as previously stated, I thought that the end result of everything, with our agreement with Northside, which is Lemon D. Hoff, the schools, and City Administration Council, was really what we're after. Was there imperfections along the way? Possibly. But I think when you look at the end result, I think we're all very happy with that. And I think Eric Bowles, to the best of his ability, complied with everything through the process. So I'm a no on the appeal.
Mr. Nickel,
Yes, I agree that Mr. Bowles did the best of his ability to abide by the law.
Mr. Grimes,
Yes, I also agree. Housing officer had the authority to grant it, and that he determined it was new construction, residential.
Ms. Gregory,
Yes, I also agree that he presented the information. He granted the abatement appropriately. I also agree that we are in a good place in our community with the agreement with the Board of Education, albeit not perfect. I would reiterate that. We are at a great point to move forward.
Mr. Soretta,
Yes, for everything else that was mentioned.
Mr. Fleckner,
Yes, and again, it's clear that new construction is eligible, and as I look at ordinance 2299, undoubtedly it's a boilerplate that was provided. Any inaccuracies or misrepresentations in there as far as sections of the code probably appear statewide in other similar ordinances. So it could have been an oversight very clearly that can always be corrected later. I don't think there was any distrust or lack of any information that was withheld from anybody. So I vote yes.
thank you all.
Mr. Chair, if I could make one post-hearing motion, if I could.
Go ahead.
First of all, I'd like to thank all of you for your thoughtful consideration tonight and your attention through the proceedings. I'd like to make an overall motion to include all of the testimony from all three of the appeals into a consolidated transcript for tonight's proceeding, and I'd like to move to admit all of the exhibits that have been submitted, and I'd be happy to run through them, or maybe Tim, you and I could go through them after the fact.
We have that on
The record.
because we have a transcript, we can match those up with, as we pass those around, we describe them. So.
Very good. And I'll also leave you with, I referenced the Gahanna-Jefferson Board of Education case.
Yes,
I'll
sir.
leave a copy of that with you so that you don't have to look that up.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right. So I move the exhibits be admitted and the testimony consolidated for all of the hearings that, for all of the appeals that we had during tonight's hearing. Thank you.
Motion to approve this statement to include all the testimony and additions or paperwork and transcripts towards these hearings.
Is there a second?
Second.
Roll call, please.
Mr. Meckel?
Yes.
Mr. Grimes?
Yes.
Mr. Holt?
Yes.
Ms. Gregory?
Yep.
Mr. Soretta?
Yes.
Mr. Foltz?
Yes.
Mr. Fleckner?
Yes.
Thank you all.
Okay, we have two more. We'll call them allegations 4 and 5. Again, first it would be Melanie Roll on the Derek and Tara Ray.
Today, October 3rd, 2017, I withdraw my appeal for the property on Harmon Street.
Is there a motion to accept the withdrawal?
Motion to accept the withdrawal from
Is
Melanie.
there a second?
Second.
Roll call, please.
Ms. Gregory?
Yes.
Mr. Holt?
Yes.
Mr. Grimes?
Yes.
Mr. Meckel?
Yes.
Mr. Foltz?
Yes.
Mr. Soretta?
Yes.
Mr. Fleckner?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rose.
Thank you. Mr. Osborne.
The Ray family hit the lottery when Mr. Bowles gave them a tax abatement for a brand-new house for 15 years. $30,000. It's probably the only house ever in this city, and the only house that ever will get a 15-year tax abatement. They can move to the North Canton, build a brand new house, put their kids through school, and not ever contribute to the infrastructure of the city and support the schools. If none of y'all have a problem with that, I withdraw my appeal. But you're paying the price, because that's what's going on with the schools now. Thank you.
Is there a motion?
I make a motion to accept Mr. Osborne's withdrawal of his appeal.
Is there a second?
I second.
Roll call, please.
Mr. Soretta?
Yes.
Mr. Holt?
Yes.
Mr. Meckel?
Yes.
Mr. Grimes?
Yes.
Ms. Gregory?
Yes.
Mr. Foltz?
Yes.
Mr. Fleckner?
Yes.
Thank you all.
Seeing that, is there a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn?
Second.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.